There are 3 certainties in life: death, taxes, and the first feature 5-star character of a Hoyoverse game having the most optimistic outlook on their future when they first come out, only for it to fall completely flat. I'm sure everyone was expecting this episode to come out. If anything, I'm more surprised that it came out so late, as the next P of Honkai Impact 3rd along with their girlfriend, Seele and Bronya definitely contributed to the mass appeal of HSR, not only attracting Genshin's player base, but the Honkai 3rd player base as well, although it must have been quite the personality shock to see the contrast between Star Seele with their more blunt, assertive, rough around the edges, no-nonsense attitude compared to the warm, friendly, and gentle one people were used to in 3rd.
Pair up with him? Ugh, alright, Luca. Let's do this.
Regardless, it was a nice start to HSR for sure, and Seele captured attention quickly, holding onto it for a fair length of version 1. Fast forward to the present day and Seele's become so near non-existent in usage rate that the only ones ambitious or rather lunatic enough to keep playing her are the die-hard Seele mains who have long since abandoned all sense of pragmatic reasoning. That aside, the time is now for our next episode of Why No One Plays. We'll be discussing Seele and everything that went wrong to make her go from a unit with insane potential that was all but wasted. Like with all version 1 units, gambling on whether they'll be able to stand the test of time is just that, a gamble. It takes a while for a gacha game to form a cohesive meta, given that in order to create a meta you need a point of reference, something that can only be achieved by quite literally throwing random stuff at the wall and waiting to see what sticks. In that regard, the approach Hoyo takes when designing version 1 characters is to make them as general as possible on account of there being no combat engines or systems to rely on. If anything, being dependent on a certain mechanic actively hurts a character's viability early on. Even if it may hurt them later down the road, the less contingent they are on something, the better. The aforementioned statement is often the reason why so many early version 1 characters have trouble holding on to relevance. They're essentially placed in a catch-22 situation, considering at the start there are no established combat engines like break, damage over time, follow-up attacks, summons, or whatnot for one to capitalize on. By trying to play into a niche without infrastructure, you're shooting yourself in the foot unless by some god-given stroke of luck Hoyo coincidentally happens to give you something to do, like what happened with Herta and Pure Fiction, then later Madame Herta. For every 1 unit created that way that made it out alive, there's like 10 units who are basically dead on arrival. On the other hand, by designing a unit who doesn't need to play into any specific type of playstyle, if and when those playstyles do come out, there will be no way for said character to ride the coattails to bolster their current meta relevance. Sadly, Seele might be the single most emblematic example of that very catch-22. The premise of Seele was quite simple: damage, lots and lots of damage. In line with the brute force mentality, the central win condition of Seele is to one-shot whatever she attacks, or die trying. To hammer that point home, they decided to focus on snowballing, getting stronger the more enemies you kill. After taking down an enemy, Seele's talent has her gain an extra turn and a staggering 80% damage bonus for that turn. While on present-day power scaling, 80% bonus damage isn't out of the ordinary, back then you couldn't find a DPS amp of that magnitude anywhere else. Through Resurgence, Seele had enough base power to effectively one-shot any non-boss enemy in the early, mid, and late game. With the way Star laid the foundation for its classes, hunt units were meant to be more single-target oriented, while Erudition was meant to clear AoEs. Despite belonging to the former, Seele's wave clearing capability was actually fairly competent, since applicably speaking, you would be able to trigger Resurgence off any action in which you weren't in that state. In fact, you were encouraged to do so, as there was an actual in-game achievement for taking 6 or more actions on Seele. A typical reset rotation would look like this. You would kill an enemy normally with either a basic attack or skill, activating Resurgence, which allowed you to kill another enemy again. Then, since most people paired up Bronya and Seele together, Bronya could advance her GL partner forward again so you could repeat the cycle, kill an enemy, then get Resurgence again, and kill another enemy, bringing you to 4. Finally, casting Ultimate outside of her turn would strike out another enemy and grant Resurgence once more, letting you take down one final target for a total of 6. In one turn cycle, Seele could actually take out more enemies than a single Erudition attack, albeit with a lot more effort and resources put into it, but quite impressive for a supposed hunt unit. Seele could exploit that reset mechanic against bosses too. If the boss in question summoned weaker enemies to fight alongside them, she would be able to take them out first and then immediately turn to the boss using Resurgence to hit them with an extra 80% more damage on top of that, making her very effective in almost every combat scenario in the early game, which no doubt lent itself to her strong reputation. However short-lived it was. Most of it was circumstantial hype though. Players were told early on that hunts would be primarily single target, so the idea of a hunt unit who can handle blast and AoE situations without falling off in pressure too hard made her look much more appealing in comparison. Especially when you think of an actual hunt unit like Genshin having the same self-buffing capability but being so much worse than her, and the 4-star competition Dan Heng and Zhu Shang not being any better. Further, Seele's independence was ultimately responsible for her early game dominance. Though you were advised to run Bronya in tandem with her, Seele could function perfectly fine without any specific team member. Simply give her whatever sustain and buffing options you had access to and go to town. Really, the only apparent situation in which you couldn't really play her comfortably was against enemies without a quantum weakness, but with Silver Wolf having been released not too long after Starl came out, you were able to, somewhat unreliably, forcibly implant quantum weakness on targets, alleviating that issue altogether. All things considered, Seele was a perfectly serviceable carry for much of version 1, finding steady employment even up to and including early version 2. Being able to benefit from anything that simply offered extra DPS allowed her some semblance of agnosticism, in that any general buffing like Ranmei, Huohuo, Sparkle, Robin and such would be guaranteed to work on her at full efficiency. Considering speed was also all the rage back in the day, Seele's high base speed and the extra speed she got from her skill enabled her to occasionally attack more than once per turn cycle. When factoring in Resurgence, anytime she gains an action she can potentially gain a second one, an appealing premise to have on a hypercarry. Begs the question though, what would happen if Seele couldn't get Resurgence? For better or worse, the bulk of her pressure is contingent on getting as many Resurgence boxes as humanly possible. The upside to this is that, like I said, any supportive utility given to her can yield a greater return on investment than if you were to buff most of the DPS characters. Any turn advance you give to her, she gets to buy one get one free deal. Any buffs you afford her, whose turn cycle is based on the caster not the receiver, she can use it that many more times. One would assume running an uber turn advancement team like Seele, Sparkle, Robin, Sunday, or something to that effect would in and of itself become a combat engine, and in theory it could. But there's one caveat, a major one at that, the activation condition of Resurgence. Seele must take down an enemy in order to activate her talent, if she can take down an enemy. What was once the crown jewel of Seele's kit has now turned into one of the biggest things holding her back in the current metagame. If you were able to reliably one-shot weaker enemies in a single attack, she was one of the best attackers in the game. But if you couldn't one-shot enemies, she would become one of the worst attackers in the game. How Seele is balanced is that on her own she's actually a pretty lousy character in relation to other attackers. For visualization's sake, let's say arbitrarily speaking she's only 75% of a unit at base. By activating Resurgence, she gets to attack again but stronger, bringing her up to say 125%. You would of course waste your initial turn to kill something other than your primary target, but the free turn you get enables you to strike the original target at a higher power level, making up that difference. However, if there are no side enemies to kill, or if you fail to kill them, you're stuck with only 75% of a character. Or worse, if you attempt to kill a side enemy and you fail to do so, you essentially wasted your turn dealing 0 damage to the target that you actually need to DPS. Thankfully, Butterfly Flurry always gains 80% damage bonus, and by casting it right before her actual turn, Seele can then power up her next basic attacker's skill without having to kill something, but the point still stands. She's entirely dependent on whether she can get Resurgence off every single one of her actions, an outcome that may not even be physically feasible. Why this hurts her so badly is because she's the character most affected by Hoyo's rapidly accelerating HP scaling on enemies. Back in version 1, non-boss or elite enemies were all one-shottable as they only had about like 50k HP at most, an easy amount for Seele to clean out in a single hit. However, once you made it to endgame, even side enemies will carry multiple hundreds of thousands of HP, making it quite the endeavor to proc Resurgence when every enemy takes multiple hits to take down. In essence, the biggest problem affecting Seele in the modern day is that you can't even play to her win condition. The unconditional Resurgence boost you get from her ultimate does help alleviate that a bit, but outside of her ultimate she just doesn't do a whole lot. The only way she can do a lot is by gaining extra turns, but circumstantially it's next to impossible to do that. A possible alternative would be to tap into a combat engine to supplement her DPS, but therein lies the aforementioned catch-22. She doesn't work in any combat engine. The extra turn mechanic isn't considered a follow-up attack, rendering her unable to benefit from that type of engine despite her extra turns being proverbial follow-ups to her initial attack. The only way to improve her DPS is by buffing her personal damage, which unfortunately brings us to the second issue with her. Seele's motion values have failed to keep up with the rapid acceleration of HSR's power scaling. Having absolutely zero way to boost her output except through direct buffs carries the knock-on effect of forcing Seele to compete against every other damage dealer in the cast, whether she likes it or not. And with how Starl's been progressing, that's a losing battle for her. She was already beginning to show signs of weakness in version 1.2 and 1.3 by way of the destruction meta, offering a more stable baseline and output thanks to being blast attackers. While she was offered a secondly sunlight through getting new supports like Ranmei, Sparkle, and Robin, flying in the face of all of that was Acheron, whose addition to the game not only outright overshadowed Seele, but set the new standard for damage dealing in Starl. Acheron became the next all-around damage dealer, and to claim that her DPS put Seele to shame would be an understatement. She totally annihilated her, not just against one enemy but also against multiple targets. Acheron's base numbers and scaling were so vast that her inclusion may very well have been a mistake for the game. You can learn more about that by watching Axe's video on the Acheronification of HSR. Definitely recommend it, it's a good watch. Anyway, the need for debuffs aside, functionally speaking, anything that can make Seele stronger would be taken that much further on Acheron, and funnily enough she did exactly that. One of Acheron's initial teams included 2 quantum characters, Sparkle or Silver Wolf and Fushuen, potentially all 3 if you had E2. She straight up hijacked the mono quantum team right from Seele despite not even being quantum herself. From then on, the DPS meta completely changed. Every single attacker that came out after was expected to achieve the same heights as Acheron, if not push beyond that. Boothill, Firefly, Jade, Yunli, Feishal, and Rappa were punching in the same weight class, causing most of version 1's units to fall to the wayside, so much so that Kafka, Silverwolf, Jingliu, and Blade all had to get buffed, unprecedented in the history of the game and a big indication of just how far power creep has progressed. You know, it would have been really nice if they included Seele in that group. Things were already looking bad for Seele back in version 2, but come version 3, it was game over. Madame Herta, Aglaya, Mide, Anaxa, Castros, Phynon, and Saber had the DPS potential of 3 Seeles combined, let alone 1. But the one cast member that was a true punch to the face to Wildfire's best fighter was Archer, another Quantum Hunt unit, more specifically, another free Quantum Hunt unit. Everyone who played during the Fate collab, which is still running to this day, received a free copy of Archer. To show you what I mean by how far behind Seele's damage is, let me show you their respective skills. At rank 10, Seele's skill does 220% damage to a single enemy. For the time it came out, yeah, it was a fairly strong skill. But look at Archer's, it does 360% quantum damage, more than 1.5 times stronger than Seele's, but if you get Circuit Connection, Archer's skill does 720. That's over triple the strength of Seele's skill at that point. It's the same with his ultimate. Seele's ultimate does 425% attack. If you account for Resurgence, it goes up to give or take 700 or so. On the other hand, Archer's ultimate is 1000%. And while we're talking about Resurgence, like I said, 80% damage bonus was a big deal back then. Now on the other hand, it's par for the course. Archer's A6 can give him 120% crit damage. I don't really know what more I can say. Archer is a better Seele. And before you say, actually Seele can clear side enemies, no she can't. That's the point. Seele can't clear side enemies anymore. She doesn't have the numbers. If she could still one-tap mooks, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. But because she's no longer allowed to waste time attacking enemies, it's her single target damage against archers and by extension everyone else's. Any which way you look at it, Seele's damage just isn't there. To be fair, this isn't endemic to just Seele. Most if not all version 1 attackers, with the exception of those who got buffed, have all but fell out of the meta at this point. The ones who stay somewhat relevant, like Kurta, Serval, Himiko, and Jingyuan, only do so by tapping into something else. Jingyuan being follow-up attack and summons, Himiko being follow-up and or break, and Serval and Herta being secondary Sir Madam Herta. Like I mentioned before, Seele is unable to follow their lead. Not only does she have no universal mechanics to latch onto, but she's a main DPS hyper carry. She's not the starting point of a team, nor is she even the midpoint of a team. She's the endpoint, but compared to most other characters in the cast, her endpoint stops much earlier. At the risk of sounding pessimistic, there's nothing that can be done to bring Seele back into the game in her current state. Absolutely nothing. She was already effectively shut down by Acheron, and then later dedicated single-target attackers like Boothill and Feishal, but with the advent of version 3 characters, Seele is nothing more than exactly what her iconic ultimate voice line says.
Illusions of the past!
If hypothetically Hoyo was open to buffing old units again like how they did for the Stellaron Hunters and Jingliu, what should they do? Besides increasing her numbers, there are 3 things I suggest. 1. Add an alternate activation condition for Resurgence, one that doesn't depend on killing enemies. If Seele can turn reset in other ways, that can drastically amplify her potential. 2. Turn Seele's skill and ultimate into chargeable momentum abilities, where for every resurgence you get throughout the course of a fight, she gets progressively more speed and more power, meaning the longer the fight goes on for, the faster and stronger she gets, and her skill and ultimate get faster too. I know Star Wars is all about front-loading Zero Cycle, but we already have plenty of those, so perhaps going for the unintuitive backloaded approach could work as well. 3 kind of plays off number 2, make Seele a combo character wherein she does more damage as she keeps attacking the same enemy. This could be another way to proc Resurgence, where if you attack the same enemy twice in one cycle, you can activate it. So even if it's just a single boss, casting her skill and turn advancing to attack again will give you Resurgence, something to give her more options, I would say. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you have any ideas on how to buff Seele? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @FarsRM, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.